What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here, and welcome back to my album ranking series. This time I'm going to be talking about, for the second time, the Iron Maiden discography, but obviously with the purpose of this video, I'm going to be re-ranking this band's discography. Now there's going to be a lot of these surprising and maybe controversial choices of where these albums are placed in this list. All of the 17 studio albums from one of my favourite bands of all time. This is all my personal opinion, and you can have a list of your own by putting them in the comments down below. And with that being said, let's dive in. Number 17 is No Prayer for the Dying. This has always been my main least favourite Iron Maiden album. The reason why that this is the lowest of the low here is because that the songwriting was very inconsistent, and I also think that a lot of the material on this album was blandly mediocre. Bruce's vocals on this album sometimes did sound quite annoying on some of these tracks, and even the production is very average as well. But I know that Maiden at this point were trying to get back into their earlier roots after the follow-up of the masterpiece that was Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. However, the overall execution of the album just did not work out all that well, in my opinion. The whole thing, to me, just had some tracks that I did like, examples of Tail Gunner to Mother Russia, and a few other tracks. But with some of the other ones, they were very forgettable and not really well arranged materials. And it's still insane to me that Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter was the only #1 single in the UK that topped the charts. No Prayer for me has been my least favourite Iron Maiden album, even when I did my original ranking. Number 16 is Virtual 11. A lot of people do put this in as the worst Maiden album in their discography. And obviously this has been really disliked so many besides the X Factor, because a lot of people just don't like or get Blaze Bayley with Maiden at all. But this is an album that I actually like better than the previous album I've mentioned of No Prayer. The production on the album is really, really good. It is an improvement to hear a fuller sound on the drums and great guitar tones. Overall repetition of the chorus on the notorious song that is The Angel and the Gambler, but I just don't like tracks like Don't Look to the Eyes of a Stranger, which has been one of my least favourite Maiden songs of all time. When Two Worlds Collide, to me, is a very average song, but nevertheless, I do enjoy this album for what it is. Future Real, to me, was a very fun, energetic opening track. The Klansman is a great song, even when Bruce was back in the band, and with Adrian Smith, they do pull the song off very well live. But I think that my favourite song on the album is The Educated Fool. Even though I do like the last track, Como Estas Amigos, the album did have moments where I can personally, in my opinion, dig this album. And I think that this is just an above average album at best. Obviously not one of the best for Maiden's catalogue, but for the finale with Blaze Bayley, I think he still did a good job before his firing, before we get to Brave New World. Number 15 is The Final Frontier. A lot of people would put this album maybe at the bottom of the barrel or at a higher voting. And yet alone, I originally put this album higher in my list. But the reason why this is really close to the bottom is that the songwriting on some of these levels of music just felt unimaginative and not really consistent. I think that the opening track, Satellite 15, is a terrible, dragged on and boring opening sound of music to begin before we get to hear the actual song of The Final Frontier, which is not a very good opening track on this album, in my opinion. The album did have a lot of purpose, lyrical contents onto this Similar sci-fi vein, but more or less onto the exploring and the whole journey landscape side onto the lyrics. I do like some of the songs on this album, like on Starblind and The Man Who Would Be King, and my favourite song on the album is Where the Wild Wind Blows, which I think is a great song. But the single of El Dorado to some of the other ones, for me, just didn't deliver all that consistently. As I've said, I gave it an above average rating in my review, and my opinions have been pretty much the same. But this is also a bit of a flaw for Bruce vocally, as his voice was sometimes pushed a bit too hard so that he strained his vocals. And we knew later on that he was diagnosed with cancer. Thankfully, he did recover from that. The Final Frontier to me is still a really solid album for Maiden, but it's not one of those that really stood up to a lot of the strengths. Number 14 is Senjutsu. Now, this was an album that I was actually originally going to be putting this album maybe in the middle, but in terms of the way the list was made in the end, the album for me is still a very good release from Maiden. But I will say this, that even though the album did gratefully deserve a lot of the number one favourite albums and best album of the year rankings, it was not all that of a complete fulfillment, because I think tracks like Death of the Celts is one of the laziest songwritings. Besides the first half being not very good, the second half is something that could have been a much better form. Stratego is a pretty solid number, but I think the other tracks like The Writing on the Wall to The Parchment, Lost in a Lost World, and these other longer progressive tracks, they were really, really good. Bruce vocally is aging so well, but I think the worst part on the album, still for me, when I listen to the album, is the overall mixing. I didn't like the sound when I wanted to hear Bruce coming out in front of the speakers, but they've been distracting to me with the bigger sound of the guitars and the drums, so that the mixing is all over the place. But with that being said, I think Senjutsu is a really solid and great album, actually, for Maiden to follow up one of the other later albums that was the Book of Souls. Number 13 is A Matter of Life and Death. This is an album that I personally feel as an underrated record. This is the only album, in a rare occasion, from Maiden themselves that they decide to record everything, live in the studio. So it does have a pretty interesting flavour into the tonality with the drums, guitars, bass and vocals. While this is not a concept album, it does make a lot of the lyrical references onto the battles and war and religion. Some of the singles did have some nostalgia for me, as I remember so well and vividly through the music videos of the horribly dated CGI music video of Different World, but also with the reincarnation of Benjamin Brigg, which has been one of the first Iron Maiden tracks that I did revisit, actually, just to get me into that mood of nostalgia, as that I was really discovering a band like Iron Maiden to hear some beauty and amazing wonders of metal music. Features some really, really strong forms of musicianship, and while the songs do have their own vision and imagery lyrics-wise, this album overall is a very solid album. Besides that, there can be some moments on a bit of repetition. I still do think that this album deserves a lot of the credit, the more people would really look back upon from what this album is. Number 12 is Fear of the Dark. Now, this was actually the very first album that I did play first to revisit this band's discography. And even though that I gave it a pretty above average review and rating, I was really surprised that I was gravitating towards a lot of the music of this album by itself. And while this has been quite a controversial album for most Maiden fans, because this is extremely different. It has a varied musical source. Some of the tracks can involve a bit of speed metal influences to some balladry, involving some more acoustic guitar arrangements, some strings, and more clean vocals. There are a lot of songs that I really was enjoying so much. Obviously with Be Quick or Be Dead, but there are songs that I like so much, like From Here to Eternity, The Fugitive, which is very underrated, and even with Wasting Love, one of the singles. And I think Chains of Misery, I think it's one of the other brilliant songs on this record. Just like with the other tracks that were not as well received. Obviously, we get to hear one of the masterpieces of Maiden's repertoire and set lists of their tours, the title track of Fear of the Dark, which is one of the greatest Maiden songs of all time. The finale moments for Dickinson before he decided to leave the band due to his solo career, I can appreciate his vocals a lot better than what he did from the No Prayer record. So I think Fear of the Dark could have been, to me, a strong album. There were a few songs that I don't care for, like Childhood's End, and I just do not care about Weekend Warrior whatsoever. But despite these negatives, Fear of the Dark is, I think, a record that has aged a lot better than more Maiden fans could have realized, in my opinion. So Fear of the Dark would have been grown to be one of my favorites. If not, maybe it would be a higher favorite. The reason why that this is not in the top 10 is because that I think some of the later ones into this list coming up have some more depth. Number 11 is Dance of Death. Now, this album was originally one of my least favorites from my ranking, but when I revisited back to this album, I've been playing it quite constantly, and I'm very happy to say that this album was an amazing album to follow up Brave New World. The production is fantastic, and there's more of the catchiness and the whole admiration onto these tracks that I didn't feel with at first when I did review the album. No More Lies is one of the favourites for me on this album, and of course with the highlights on some of the historical lyrical contents of songs like Montségur to Passchendaele. Also Journeyman as a finale to conclude the album beautifully is another highlight on the record. I think from what I did say about Journeyman, the band originally was going to do it with their electric distorted sound, but to finalize things in this laid-back, cozy, balladry affair of acoustic guitars, it is wonderful. Wildest Dreams to Rainmaker is a couple of great tracks to start the album, and there's a lot of energy that was surrounding the band at this point. It's very atmospheric as well. Some people would say that this is not as near perfect or perfect like Brave New World. This is another one like Fear of the Dark that some people would be, missing out on and see this as another underrated cut of music material for Maiden. I would say that this album did get better with me over time when I mentally played this album so many times. Some of the flaws like The Age of Innocence and Face in the Sand to me have been pretty good songs, but they didn't deliver a lot of the music's quality. And obviously with the abomination that is the album's cover art that I still hate as one of the worst album covers of all time. But then there's this famous saying, don't judge by its cover, because amazingly the music is what matters the most when it comes to albums. So Dance of Death for me was a massive improvement for me to warm myself into quite a whole lot. Alright, so we are now into the top 10. Number 10 is Peace of Mind. People would say this as one of the best or the classics in Maiden's discography. But the reason why this is at number 10, I think it is a very, very good record, but for some reason I never really delivered this album so much as highly in a very favourable move of feelings. This is Nico McBrain's debut, with him being Maiden's drummer. Some of his drumming is amazing on this record. Where Eagles Dare is one of my favourite songs on opening tracks for Maiden, and obviously you get to hear the very popular big hit, The Trooper. Now, despite what I said about The Trooper in my review, it is a great song, but I defend my opinion that I just do not like to hear The Trooper by itself, because I think it has never been one of my top favourite Maiden songs, and it is personally overrated. But in terms of hearing it as a part of this album, this is one of the highlights. The musicianship can be, really changeable. You can definitely hear the bigger influences into darker lyrical contents and super tight and as really, really upbeat and as exciting. Bruce's vocals were wonderful on this record. Tracks like Revelations to the later tracks, they were very, very good, full of the excellent skill and dexterity into the overall passion that's been put into this album. But there are other albums that I personally do like and later on love more. Number 9 is Killers. This is an album to follow up the debut album, to me, in a very successful way. And I was really impressed with Paul Di'Anno's vocals on this album. He definitely boosted up a lot of the excitement and the higher vocal registers. And Killers did strike out with a bang from the start to the end. And musicianship-wise is pretty much second to none. Has got to feature some of the best early cuts of this album. You got Wrathchild to Murders in the Rue Morgue, and one of my favourites is Purgatory to the instrumental pieces of Genghis Khan, which I really enjoyed a lot. And even though that the album Killers is to me very good, I am pretty much more of a bigger fan of the first album a lot more, which you will obviously see later on in the list. But what a brilliant, brilliant second album for a band that are reaching new highs. Number 8 is The Book of Souls. This is one Maiden album that I still feel like that it's just spectacular. It's a spectacular release. And as I've mentioned it before, and I'll say it again here, that this was my favourite album of 2015. This is where Iron Maiden were being so creative and as adventurous. The longest album in their discography, closely knocked off by Senjutsu's length. But The Book of Souls just have a consistent flow into admirable, progressive and creative ideas. Almost track after track after track has been jam-packed with wonderful chemistries, and delivering this music in this hugest and biggest form of making something just as admirable and as addictive as possible. Great tracks like The Single Speed of Light, If Eternity Should Fail, Tears of a Clown, and some of the other longer tracks were just amazing. Empire of the Clouds, one of the greatest Maiden songs of all time, and even vocally with Bruce Dickinson has been improved a lot better than what he did on The Final Frontier. So there's just no rhyme or reason that The Book of Souls is one album from Iron Maiden, even in the later period of their career to this point, that just never ceases to amaze me. I do love a lot of The Book of Souls. The stunning musicians that they are can make music in a powerful form in their whole presence. And The Book of Souls defines Iron Maiden at one of their absolute best. Number 7 is Brave New World. Now, this is one album that has been a huge favourite for me, and while I do see it as, I guess, a bit of a comeback album for Maiden, but at the same time, it's not really, because this is the follow-up after the 2-year gap with the release of Virtual 11, firing Blaze Bayley, and to bring back Adrian Murray and Bruce Dickinson, making this album the first ever time with Maiden's contributions with a 3-guitar member partnership. The Wicker Man just assaults you with so much power, with energetic riffs and very melodic and moving tracks like Blood Brothers. Other strong songs on this, like Out of the Silent Planet and Dream of Mirrors, is to me the highlight on the album, which is another classic in itself. The production is beautiful. I love the attack on the drums, these crunching guitars. Brave New World is one album that personally needs no introduction, in my opinion, and I'm sure a lot of fans will agree with me on that. But what can we say about Brave New World that hasn't been addressed already? It is a very strong, near-perfect record for Maiden, and to follow up Virtual 11 on a record like this is just tremendous. And it still amazes me that some of the tracks that were written from Virtual 11 had been involved in this. What a great surprise. But nevertheless, Brave New World, what an amazing album. Number 6 is The Number of the Beast. A lot of fans would rank also this album as one of the classics, like with Powerslave and Peace of Mind. This is the final album that we hear Clive Burr, who did an outstanding job. But when you hear Bruce Dickinson for the first time on this album after Paul Di'Anno's involvement, this is an achievement to behold. His whole tone and debut performance with Maiden definitely boosted up a lot of greater sounds. This is where Iron Maiden were finally crafting themselves at building their signature sound. Tracks like Invaders to the title track The Number of the Beast, and the other epic long songs like Hallowed Be Thy Name is glorious to listen to. Gangland to 22 Acacia Avenue. This is an album that has a lot of banging hooks and crushing and versatile moments. One of the essential albums for beginners to get into heavy metal. This is one album like Brave New World that is near perfect, and it still stands out as pretty much a classic album, especially into this movement of the new wave of British heavy metal. Number 5 is the debut album, and you know where I would go with this. I think this is a bigger favourable album for me, in my opinion, than Killers. Production can be very questionable. The only one album produced by Will Malone, who did a very solid job. I think the production is what adds a distinctive beginning vibe and feeling of what Maiden wanted to achieve later on in their music. Maiden can make an attitude, because while we all knew that this sounds very punky inspired, to which I think Steve Harris was getting critical with it, besides the production, I think it definitely fits in. It has a separate charm to it. Even Dennis Stratton, with his only debut time working with Maiden for this album, did a really well set of work to be involved, and it is an engaging album. I love a lot of this record, like Remember Tomorrow to Prowler, Transylvania, Iron Maiden, the title track. One album when I could just sit back and have a blast. A really strong debut album, and this was released at the same time when Black Sabbath was resurrected with Heaven and Hell, Judas Priest with British Steel, Wheels of Steel from Saxon, and as well as with Maiden, as far as I'm concerned, they have released a belter of a debut album. Number 4 is Somewhere in Time. This is one Maiden album that I was absolutely admiring. When I listened back to Somewhere in Time, I just couldn't believe this phenomenal identity of an album that this really is. And obviously, originally, Bruce Dickinson wanted this album to be packed and filled with acoustics of music, but the rest of the band declined it. This is the sci-fi inspiration that it definitely deserves this big, huge credit here. Caught Somewhere in Time is one of my favourite Maiden songs, and Wasted Years is still fun and brilliant to listen to with its catchy chorus and memorable hook, and tracks like Heaven Can Wait to another long classic, Alexander the Great. It was just a glorious listening approach. And I think Deja Vu is an awesome song, severely underappreciated and quite a misunderstood one. With this being the follow-up to Powerslave, is a unique idea, and that's what I adore the most about this album. And yet this album cover art is still one of my favourites of all time, and this is just as a triumphant follow-up, just like with a lot of Maiden's albums, has won me over, that I would personally pick and listen to over one of their biggest albums of all time, that being, as I've said, The Number of the Beast. Somewhere in Time is another classic record. Number 3 is Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. This is the concept inspired from the novel based on difference between the good and the evil, and the seventh son origin has been contrasted wonderfully on this album. This also credits some more involvement into synthesizers and Iron Maiden at their most progressive, like what they've achieved on the Book of Souls, but this is where you can hear more of this progressive metal tinge, besides their classic sound. Moonchild to Infinite Dreams, Can I Play With Madness, and to me, the best song on the album, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. The rest of the whole album, the production is just beautiful. It sparkles and glistens with top-tier tones, guitars-wise, drums-wise, and this soars in as dramatically for Bruce vocally, like what he did with Number of the Beast and Somewhere in Time. But I see that Seventh Son of a Seventh Son is another essential record for newer Maiden fans. Seventh Son is a mega important album, especially when Maiden were improving, exploring, and finding many new ideas and grounds to gravitate themselves as a band. And Seventh Son of a Seventh Son is absolutely one of the best examples with those very, very big reasons. Number 2 is The X Factor. Now, a lot of people would see this as my favourite Maiden album, but personally for me, while it is still my favourite Maiden album, there's one other album that is another main favourite, but with another word, which I will talk about in a minute, is to me the most underrated. I have already talked about The X Factor so many times, but in a nutshell, this is the darkest album Maiden had put out. This is, to me, an underrated masterpiece. Obviously, behind the scenes, personally, mentally and emotionally, Steve Harris was going through a terrible divorce, the loss of his father, his big depression had risen up. But what a brave achievement that he decided to write his most personal lyrics, like on some of the songs of 2 a.m. to Look for the Truth, Judgment of Heaven. But I think what stands out the best way on The X Factor is, without doubt, the darkness and the heavy mentality into this form of music. Besides that, some people criticize it for its length and a bit of repetition, which I do get, but this album features, to me, the greatest underrated tracks, like The Edge of Darkness, based on Apocalypse Now, and another personal song, The Unbeliever. And I also adore tracks like Look for the Truth, to Fortunes of War, Sign of the Cross, which is my favourite Iron Maiden song of all time. And obviously the album has been despised and trounced because of Blaze Bayley. I know that Blaze was involved in this band because he was making something really new and big for him at the time in his career. His vocals have improved over time, even after Virtual 11, but I defend, in my opinion, that this is the most underrated Iron Maiden album and quite possibly the most underrated metal album of all time. I have no apologies to say that whatsoever because I have been a huge beloved fan of this album and you cannot change my mind otherwise. So the X Factor is the last classic album from Iron Maiden. And number one, my favourite Maiden album, besides the X Factor, of course, is Powerslave. The extra word that I will say about Powerslave is best. This is another favourite and to me the best album Iron Maiden had created. This is their tour de force, ferocious record at the same time. The war epic tracks of Aces High and Doomsday Clock lyrics on 2 Minutes to Midnight. Flash of the Blade as well is another essential listen, and the more than 10-minute epic of Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The production is out of this world. The whole sound of the band here sounded just as dynamic and heavy. This is an out there record, and the album's cover art is my favourite Iron Maiden album cover as well. So Powerslave, like with the X Factor, is one Maiden album that I will never ever get distracted or bored with at all. This is the definitive album in Iron Maiden's discography, an ascending and greatest form than any other album that Iron Maiden has made, in my opinion. And that's why this album is my number one. There you go, guys. That is my list of my 17 Iron Maiden albums ranked. Let me know what you think of this in the comments down below. Please do share your list. Which is your favourite or least favourite? I am very, very interested to see your comments and views on your list and with mine. Let's share a lot of banter, share a lot of positivity and varied opinions of this band's legendary discography. Thank you guys for watching, and I will keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future. Up the irons!